Good morning, everyone. In the interest of time, I suggested we start, so we're already 5 minutes behind schedule. I'm going to be chairing this session, so I'm going to start right away and give the floor to Dr. Manal Shihabi, who will talk to us about diversification effects of energy subsidy reforms in MENA oil exporters. The floor is yours.
بونجور بلشنا بالتكسير جاي من فرنسا حضرتك؟
Gilets jaunes. Gilets jaunes.
صباح الخير. Bonjour. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. I am very pleased to be here with you at AUB, and I really want to thank the organizers for putting this together. I'm going to be standing and moving, but I see what we do about the microphone. Microphone.
Over here, can we speak without a microphone? Yeah. Okay.
So I'll be talking to you today about the diversification effects of energy subsidy reform in the Middle East and North Africa, in oil exporters, MENA countries, using illustrations from Kuwait. This is going to be basically the map for today's presentation. And I'm going to start with a short context and contribution of the work. So yesterday we heard quite a bit about the over-dependence on petroleum, as it was nicely put. But basically, it was really this collapse of the oil price in mid-2014 that pretty much exposed a lot of the challenges that oil economies have, and then pretty much also triggered a lot of reform. And here, the trends pretty much in the links of the economy and its over-dependence on oil are pretty much the same across the country. So I'm just giving examples just to give you an idea. Using here, we see from Kuwait that the movement of the oil price is in the green line, but also the oil production, and apologize, the green line is GDP, which moves in line with the oil production in the blue lines, as well as the oil price in the red line here. The same for net foreign reserves, using data from Saudi Arabia. The same thing for net foreign reserves, moved exactly with the oil price. And it's really this link that makes these economies very vulnerable to, of course, their sustainability issues, but also volatility of the oil price. And thank you. Governments have been proposing these reforms. I think the most important reforms, in my opinion, that have been proposed as pretty much the solution to overcome government revenue crunch has been first diversification, which is not a new policy. It's been in development plans for a very long time. But there's been very little, as we heard yesterday, very little success measures on that front. And sustainability or diversification is important not only because we want sustainability in because we might run out of oil or might not run out of oil, but also because non-oil sectors pretty much give a buffer in the economy to reduce the shocks of volatility in the oil price. The other one is fiscal reform. And unlike diversification, there's been some improvement and some success on fiscal reform. And this was particularly after the drop of the oil price again. And this is another example where the oil revenues were moving with the oil price and declined after 2014, while you have basically subsidies and fiscal cost increasing at some point, basically meeting. And that pretty much triggered, this is also using data from Kuwait, but it's similar trends across the oil exporters across the region. And in the GCC, for example, the oil price in 2015 was $0.3 per liter, and it went up in 3 years later by 80%. So there's a bit of improvement in this, on this front. My interest is really the links between subsidy reform and diversification. To what extent are they linked? Does one help the other? Really mostly because fiscal reform has happened. What's the effect of fiscal reform on diversification? There's been little work done in this front, actually. There's been rising work and studies on the impact of energy subsidy reform on welfare and the macroeconomy, but the results have been inconclusive. In the context of a qualitative study, examining diversification, particularly as a result of a subsidy reform, has not been happening. But there was, when we think of diversification in non-oil sectors, we cannot really think about an oil economy or resource-based economy without thinking of the context of the Dutch disease literature, the so-called Dutch disease. And interestingly, this, from my recollection, did not come up in yesterday's talks at all. But Dutch disease, it's a bit of explanation here, but basically is when there's a boom in oil or any resource revenue because of the rise in the price, that basically leads, there's a flow of rent that come, which basically causes an appreciation of the exchange rate, and that in turn hurts the competitiveness of the non-oil sectors internationally, so exports of non-resource decline, but then the tradable sector in the economy basically expands because people have more money, they want to buy more coffees and build more buildings and do more construction. So there's an expansion of the resource of the non-traded sector. And there's been quite a bit of work in that regard. There's been also some work evidencing some Dutch disease effects in the MENA region. Often, when I actually started my research in Kuwait, a lot of prominent economists have said, why are you even bothering? This is just a Dutch disease story. And is it? I don't really think it is. But what's interesting, though, is when we have a Dutch disease situation, the opposite, like now what's happening when the decline of the oil price, should also happen. We should have reverse Dutch disease. In other words, we should have more diversification in a low oil price environment because non-oil sectors, according to this theory, should expand when there's a depreciation of the oil price, or the exchange rate happening due to a decline of the oil price and oil revenue. What I want to do here is I really want to look at the state of diversification and then to quantify the impact of energy subsidy reform in a low oil price environment, the impact of that on diversification in a distorted, these are key words, distorted, small, open, dependent economy, and I'll be doing that using illustrations from Kuwait. Small is not in size or population, it's in reference to the rest of the world and the ability of that country to change prices internationally. That's what small here means. And I'm going to be doing that using an economy-wide general equilibrium model because these models are pretty much have been shown to be really the best in examining those kind of effects of policy and shocks because they have basically show aggregation on the macro side, but also linkages between industries, but also when we have first and second effect impacts because of distortions, you can capture that in an economy-wide general equilibrium model. So the paper uses a two-region model that has oligopolistic behavior and embodies the key features of the Kuwaiti economy, and it expands earlier work that I've done also in Kuwait. And the important contributions is basically it offers a unique perspective, I believe, on economic efficiency in the context of MENA, as well in oligopolistic behavior and the regulation, and managing oil rents, but also non-oil rent. And to my knowledge, I think this is the only study or qualitative study that features diversification as a central theme in the context of energy subsidies. Okay, so let's talk about diversification a bit. Giacomo yesterday, where is he? He said yesterday in the morning session that there is actually diversification happening. So it is underway, and I'm actually I agree with that. I'm going to take it a step further and say there actually is already diversification. But at the same time, we have a problem of overdependence. And I'm going to show you data for you to hopefully convince you. So this is the economic structure or structural elements of the Kuwaiti economy from data from 2013. And this came out of the data that I took and then assembled it in a database that I used in my model. So I'm going to take a bit of a step back. If that's the microphone. But basically here you can see I'm going to consider mining, crude oil, gas and petro services, oil refining, electricity, and other network services, which includes water. These are pretty much some energy. If you look at, they dominate value add in terms of GDP as in factor price, and then the second contributor is other services, which is mostly non-tradable. It's our coffees, our hotels, our construction. But if you actually consider all of the non-energy and non-water sectors, there is more than 38% of the value add of the economy is actually from non-oil and non-water. So there's a base, right? It's 38%, it's not small. But why is that not transferring somehow to what we would expect diversification to be? And I'm going to explain it. I'm going to argue that it's not a Dutch disease story. What I'm going to argue is, and hopefully then show it in the results of the model, is that it's actually due to huge constraints and distortions of the economy and structural constraints really that are pretty much limiting this. And Sam yesterday talked a little bit about that, but then hopefully you'll see this in the context of Kuwait at the moment. So if you follow with me, the blue is basically our energy and water sectors, and the yellow is everything else, which is 38%. This basically, in terms of its factor contribution, energy and water are very capital intensive, employing only 8% of the value added comes from labor, while the non-energy and water sectors are 55% labor. So they're very labor intensive. So that's the first idiosyncratic feature. It's kind of the sector. Second, if you follow the blue, about half of it only goes to exports, with the rest is domestic consumption, while the yellow, the 38.2%, most of it is domestic consumption, with only 9% goes to exports. And then how does that then translate to government? So we don't have diversification in the export base. How does that actually go to government budget? 90% of this 55% exports basically builds the government budget, and then very little comes from here because there's obviously no taxes. So the 38.2% basically does not contribute to the fiscal diversification, right? And then there's some subsidies as well that go from the budget to the industries. The government, in turn, invests mostly in public sector and in the energy sector. What happens to capital? Capital is another feature here. So I already told you this is labor intensive. In terms of capital and sovereign wealth fund, most of the capital in the economy is basically locked. And that's a huge constraint for diversification. Locked largely in the energy and water sectors, as I've explained, but also because the money, whatever remains, some of it goes to support the public firms, but a lot of it goes abroad in the sovereign wealth funds that are managed by the Kuwait Investment Authority, and a lot of other oil exporters have similar funds. So that means that most of the funds either go abroad or are locked already. So we have a problem with mobility of capital and investments. The subsequent feature that kind of results from this, also a large constraint, is the public sector. So in the context of diversification now, I'm giving you an idea of how basically the economic structure and features of the economy, what they are. So the public sector dominates the economy, employing the majority of Kuwaiti labor and contributing more than 65% of GDP. Huge current expenditures, about 80% of that is current expenditures of the government budget, half of which is the public wage bill. That's huge. And then you also have pervasive rent redistribution. So lots of the energy basically goes to the public through very generous welfare distributions. On the other side, from the non-energy sector, there are oligopolies. And I've done this in previous work, and I'm happy to show you more work on this or evidence on this in the Q&A session. But there's pretty much oligopolistic features in every single sector of the Kuwaiti economy. And that is a problem for lots of reasons, in part because oligopolies are very distortionary. Also, oligopolists tend to capture a lot of markups up and beyond the actual competitive price. And what that means is that the markup that they gain is actually diverting away from investing in in competitive projects. So it's been accepted in economic theory that when you have competition induces growth, right? It's the whole idea of creative destruction. When you have oligopolies, you're not going to have any of that. And that also means that it's going to impair competition, low investments in R&D, but also reduces largely the economic efficiency of as well. And here where the private sector also fits, the private sector employs more than 92% of the expatriate labor in Kuwait, let's focus on Kuwait, are employed by the private sector, but also the expatriate labor are the majority of labor in the country. So that means that we have two separate labor markets here as well. And then the other thing that happens in the private sector when you have this kind of structure is you have weak links. So there are weak links from these sectors over here to the remaining sectors within them, and obviously back to energy. And that, if you have weak links, then you're not going to have significant diversification either. And when you have a productivity decline in one sector, it's going to reduce productivity in the other sectors as well as a result. Now, the public firms is also a problem because that means that the government is heavily involved, a case in which the government is basically, the public sector is affecting both supply and prices in the market. And then you also have linkages between the public sector and the private sector through the what I call socio-political linkages. So you have, the business elite and whatever, and the government basically communicating. And what that also means is that when you have heavy government spending, it can actually impact the outcome of industries. So it basically can affect diversification, right? And then the final note on this, so now this is, I hope you kind of get the picture of why diversification is weak despite that 38.2%. And the other last comment I'll say on this is because of the big sovereign wealth fund. And I've argued before that I think it was a deliberate policy by the government to invest in this because technically this is a diversified source of income. And with that, there's little incentive, therefore, to diversify the rest of the economy. Let's go very briefly to the modeling. Yes, someone talk to me? Oh. So now I want to test my argument that I just put forth to you in using the model quantitatively. So the model basically is an extension of Shihabi 2017, which you probably don't know, but basically it's a CGE model that also captures, has oligopoly behavior and captures the unique features of the Kuwaiti economy. But what I've done here is the different subsidies have particular subsidy rates, consumption subsidy rates, so that I can simulate energy reform. It has some standard features of general equilibrium modeling, which, 5 minutes? Okay. Which includes small open economy, Armington elasticities, and real aggregation. But it also breaks away from conventional CGE modeling by incorporating oligopoly representation. And then it includes the features of the Kuwaiti economy that I just explained to you in the context of diversification. In the model, there's one representative household, what basically shows the behavior of one larger household, so people basically, who consume products, supply labor and skill, but also own the capital. And then we also have firms that rent the capital and hire workers and pay them wages. And then we also have basically the government, which is fully represented here. It captures mostly all revenue, but also can collect taxes and transfer heavy subsidies and welfare payments. Factors of production. There's a standard capital, arable land, natural resource, and labor, but in this model, I've taken labor and split it out between expatriate and Kuwaiti, and then I've taken a second layer and taken them between skilled and unskilled for each. And then the flexibility of employment contracts for the expatriate workers is represented. And then finally, this is the number of industries aggregated throughout the economy to 14. And in case anybody wants to know about the equation blocks, it's been done through a software called GEMPAC. This is pretty much the model. So we have full financial flows into the country, but also out of the country represented, and then full domestic policy and government. On the demand side, there's 5 sources of demand, including exports as well as government and final demand. And consumption, basically, consumers can choose between a variety differentiated local products, which is further differentiated from imports. On the supply side, all industries are oligopolistic, which basically means that they are carrying they produce and supply differentiated products, but also they carry fixed cost and labor and capital, and they set their prices in a way that they maximize profit, and they can collude with each other. So we know oligopolies talk to each other, they can set prices, and they can collude in it. And then they can also be subject to a regulator, theoretically, that can limit this level of collusion. It is not a dynamic model, it says comparative static, but it has features in the way that I solve the model that basically would limit or mimic the behavior of the economy in the long run. And I will be focusing only on the long run. So in my last few minutes, I want to talk about the simulation that I ran. So if you remember what I mentioned earlier about the Dutch disease stuff, we should expect now that with the decline of the oil price and subsidy reform, we should have a larger, diversification base, right? So let's see if that actually happens. So basically here I shocked the oil price made a shock to the oil price, so there's a decline in the oil price, and then also reformed, similar to what actually happened in reality, I reformed, imposed a shock whereby the gasoline prices are raised, energy prices are raised. And what we finally see is basically it is a contractionary, two shocks are contractionary for the whole economy. Importantly, and then there is a loss of welfare. So welfare measured by real disposable income is lowered. Fiscally, it's very unsustainable, of course, from the government's perspective. And then over here, importantly, there's the depreciation of the exchange rate, which we would expect. And it is this that should basically drive a lot of the expansion of the non-oil exports, and also make imports more expensive. But what we actually find is that there is, it's not there. There's very small expansion in non-petroleum exports as a percentage of GDP, less than 0.5%, so that's quite small. And we also see that actually imports rise because to make this expansion, it's labor intensive, so the expatriate labor employment increases, but also for inputs, there's not a lot of input that is produced locally, a lot of that is produced sourced through imports. And then finally, from the oligopolistic behavior here, what we see is there's a very small decline in average markups. And that, through other work that I've also done before, basically a huge efficiency of the economy is captured by these oligopoly rents. So they have no incentive, therefore, to go abroad and export abroad because they can capture a lot of huge markups internally, basically.
Could you just explain to me why the household change is 50%, why firms?
No, it is, they're both 50%, but household, in firms, it's a weighted average so it's weighted average because it's one tax rate one rate for all industries, for intermediate demand. And basically what I ended up with that is a percent. So it's 5% as a weighted share, which translates to 50% rise of the energy price. But it's effectively 50% rise of the energy price for intermediate input locally, as well as for the final consumer. Actually, for all 5 sources of demand.
So can you define again the markup, the average markup?
Yes, so the markup basically, if you can imagine that an oligopoly, and there's oligopolists in all economies, should set the price at average cost. So the markup would be whatever the pure profit additional that is raised above that level. And it's interesting here because what happens is, if this is the price that should be, or the average cost, the consumer isn't paying it because the consumer has subsidies, so the consumer pays lower. And then what that means is that the actual producer as well can basically set even a higher price because the price, remember how I said the government intervenes in prices. So the consumer is paying the low price, but then the actual charge that the producer can charge is significantly higher. So you have a really high markup basically throughout all industries. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's typical.
Oh yeah, exactly. I'm quite mindful of time, so I'm going to move forward. So because of these constraints, this basically proves to me that the constraints that I've said in the economy are really the reason that we don't have diversification. So I wanted to test my second proposal is if we reduce some of the constraints that I've said earlier, would that actually improve the diversification situation? So what I ended up doing here is imposing a competition. I took the exact same shocks that I had before, energy pricing reform, oil price shock, and then I added competition reform, so the government can basically force oligopolies to reduce their collusion. Also a productivity shock, and also I allowed, obviously very politically sensitive, but I imagine that we can actually let Kuwaiti labor who are unskilled leave the public sector and move to be more competitive wages and competitive jobs in the private sector. And what we find is significant expansion that basically translates throughout the economy. So you have real GDP and GNP are no longer negative as before, they're positive. We have a further depreciation of the real exchange rate, which supports even much further expansion of the non-oil sectors. In fact, 9% extra of non-oil exports are added to the economy just by these, by reducing some of the constraints, basically, and having some productivity shocks. Then there's, on the fiscal side, it's more sustainable. Importantly, welfare, huge improvement in welfare as well, relatively. And then finally, if you look here at the industry and oligopoly markups, there's a decline in markups, which basically means that this is an improvement in efficiency. There are efficiency gains that translate throughout the economy. And because we also have the non-oil sector, if you remember, it was very labor intensive. So now the labor that's being added, extra employment, is no longer just from the expatriate labor, but also from the Kuwaiti labor. So we can actually see a potential solution for disguised unemployment that's heavily existing in the public sector.
Why the colors, red and blue, although they are the same sign, positive, positive?
Where?
Where in the unskilled labor, I am confused.
In unskilled labor? Oh, this red, just to kind of highlight it for you to kind of,
Highlight.
yeah, so here it is positive, but it's only a small improvement, most of, actually all of which comes from the expatriate labor.
The color is just to highlight.
Color is just for you to, highlighting importance of the result. And then finally, so basically we can see here that we do have pro-diversification effects. I'm going to skip this. I'm just going to show you here exports as a percent of GDP. You can see if you only have energy subsidy reform, not a lot of improvement. If you have all other microeconomic reforms, basically you're going to have significant improvement eventually. Finally, let me talk about what does this actually mean at the end in terms of policy in the last 1 minute that I have. So I've showed you now that they're even though we have a set diversified base, it's pretty much has failed so far to contribute to exports or to actual fiscal diversification for the constraints that I have set earlier before you. But then if we have, and also the important message here is that the large share of economic efficiency is captured by these inefficiencies and largely preventing diversification, whether it's tradable or non-tradable, to actually occur. And then the reason I selected these particular shocks, because I thought even though reform in general is very politically sensitive, there might be the more politically viable options. In Kuwait and throughout the MENA region, as we talked yesterday, achieving a political equilibrium is very important, but also it's been based on having a lot of these constraints that are limiting some of the economic improvements. But the key thing is, with appropriate incentives, reverse Dutch disease can actually happen and can actually be productive. But there are lots of trade-offs, as I've showed you, that a policymaker should pretty much take into account. Particularly with efficiency gains when it comes to having a lot of expatriate labor, for instance, but also when it comes to fiscal stabilization vis-a-vis cost of living adjustment, diversification, and industrial expansion. And finally, in the countries that we have where there's pervasiveness of oligopolies, I think the idea really that I hope is clear to you, that without microeconomic reform, you cannot achieve the very lofty goals that economy or governments have. And potentially there's a lesson of the sequencing of the reforms here, because I showed you things that haven't happened, but they could be actually quite beneficial. And then but they cannot really exist in a vacuum or on their own. They have to be a set of larger pillars of reforms, whether it's institutional in the larger sense of institutions, environmental, social, and even economic culture. And on that note, I think I will stop.
I have a
you very
question
much.
here.
In the interest of time, I suggest we're already 10 minutes behind schedule, so can I suggest that we leave the questions to the very end? Or
I have a comment because Manal mentioned about the Dutch disease. It was not mentioned yesterday. It is an example of the oil curse or resource curse. And the Dutch disease that started in 1959, I agree with you what you said, that the currency appreciated and then exports were expensive, and that's why it led to a recession. I heard you saying that when you expect revenues to go down because of oil prices, the opposite will happen. I disagree with that, especially in the GCC, because the currency is not floating, it's pegged, as you know. Second, I don't know if they have anything to export. And I think some of your results in the simulation showed that, et cetera. And I was wondering whether your data or something you did simulation, which is great, but whether you have a real data where the oil prices went down and what happened and what the government did.
I disagree with the resource curse theory, and I don't think the Dutch disease is a disease. It actually is just a matter of life, that it's really just an economic condition that happens in all resource-based economies. But according to the theory, and it actually happens in places like Australia where they do have reverse Dutch disease, and it can happen also when the exchange rate is pegged. There could potentially be an expansion of the non-resource sector when there is a decline of the resource sector. But I've already explained, for the reasons of the constraints that I've explained, why this, agreeing with you, while this would not be the case in the GCC economy. In terms of data, interestingly, luckily for me, this uses data from 2013. So now I can go and actually see what happens in 2017 and some of the 2018 data, and pretty much the predictions of the model have held true. So we see expansion of both exports and imports, for instance, non-oil exports and imports, and similarly for data. The most, sector level, we don't have data. The most recent is 2015 that I've just received.
I realized that. I realize that I'm constrained. I will ask a quick question.
Yes.
Maybe we can discuss it later.
Yes.
Yesterday in the panel, I made a remark that in order to help effect energy subsidy reforms and economic reforms in general, you have to convince the public that there is something in it for them. And I've been proposing and advocating that part of the benefit to the economy at the macro level, which goes to the state, part of it that goes to the state, if it's explicitly shared with the public and explained that in the beginning, that part of the saving goes to the public. So my question to you, is there a way to capture and validate what that statement in your models? And if
yes.
it is captured, this would be very useful to highlight it in the results and the conclusions, because I think that's where you want to base the information from the government that, look, guys, the public at large, we are reforming the subsidy, you are losing a little bit here, but this is how we are sharing, you're benefiting. And finally, more explicitly, with the government handing out part of that saving to the public in a different way, like cash distribution. Many people have been advocating cash distribution. I wonder whether your model can verify that and simulate and see what results come out.
Well, I'll just show very quickly. The model here, you can see under government, I do have welfare payments, and this actually means what the increase basically in government handouts, so to speak, to the public. So it's pretty much actually what you were mentioning actually happened. So here, in the first case, we see that there's a decline in overall disposable income, but also an increase in government handouts. Here, the opposite happens. People are basically, there's more income, more disposable income, and then you can see there's almost a 4% decline of government handouts. So that basically tells us that there is, in the model it is captured, and I think in reality it is, there is some mechanism when when subsidies are reformed and people's cost of living increases, the government, for political reasons obviously, and sometimes economic, the government is transferring part of that to the public. With details of cash transfers, I won't comment on the viability or on whether they're good or not, but I plan at some point in the future of kind of incorporating them in more details in the model.
Thank you very much for an excellent presentation.
Thank you, everyone.
Our next speaker, Dr. Nathalie Helmi, will talk to us about energy transition and economic development, lessons from Algeria.
Oh, that's interesting.
From Algeria.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to present this paper on behalf of my co-authors. In the background of post-COP21, low oil prices and development of renewable energies, studying the energy transition in an oil-exporting country such as Algeria makes sense. There is a strong political will to seize the moment, especially with the Paris Agreement on climate change now in force. The main objective of the COP for this century is to keep a global temperature level well below 2 degrees Celsius. To reach its goals, appropriate financial flows will be put in place, thus making stronger action by developing countries possible in line with their own national objectives. In this respect, the energy transition from fossil fuels to a decarbonized world is the main key to maintain a livable planet. Our objective is to formulate proposals for transitioning to a high percentage of renewable energy use with a focus on the national level within a global challenge, but also to recommend sustainable energy policies that encourage economic growth, social well-being, and environmental protection with respect to the sustainable development paradigm. In the first part, we will consider the evolution of sources of energy in the world because energy transitions means a long-term structural change in energy systems. In the second part of our study, we will focus on the clean energy within Algeria, comparing to the new sources of energy with the fossil energy. We will also try to forecast the evolution of the different kinds of energy, their cost of production, their consumption, and the reserves. Finally, based upon our analysis, we will try to present some policy recommendations to decision makers in order to implement the international agreements without threatening the chances of Algeria to have a sustainable development. The energy transition is crucial for fighting climate change and achieving the sustainable development. The term energy transition means a significant change in energy policy, and solving the energy problem is regarded as the most important challenge facing humankind in the 21st century. Since the Industrial Revolution, the economies are highly dependent on low-cost and easy-access energy. More than 80% of the world energy is fossil, but because of the CO2 emissions and their consequences on climate change, they should be mitigated and the population should adapt. Energy is essential for economic growth and preservation of the environment. To end extreme poverty and promote shared prosperity, access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy is crucial. Modernizing energy services means improving the quality of life of millions of people around the world and enhancing progress in all areas of development. You can see here the evolution of energy production. Sorry. For the first time this year, renewable sources of energy have overtaken coal in terms of cumulative installed power capacity in the world. About 500,000 solar panels were installed every day around the world last year. Solar power is a game changer for developing countries that are swiftly embracing the renewable source of energy to close their electricity access gaps and meet climate change mitigation goals. The Algerian way of life is based on and shaped by an abundant and cheap energy, and first and foremost on fossil hydrocarbons, oil and natural gas. Yet this model is clearly unsustainable. As evidenced by the various available indicators, including estimation of reserve and annual production capacity compared to projection of domestic consumption. According to the figures and statistics, it is clear that given the decline in domestic production of hydrocarbons, physical depletion of fossil energies in Algeria has become a dramatic reality. It is not only a problem for future generations, but already the one of the current generation. On the supply side, a critical threshold is reached when marginal revenue equals marginal cost based on the current price. With low prices, a crisis may occur even when a resource is still widely available. The country's potential in terms of fossil fuels is not fully exploited, and exploration activities onshore and offshore is still going on. Energy demand for international needs increases, while energy demand for exports decreases, as well as available energy. Several factors determine the growth of domestic demand. This growth is explained largely by population growth that exceeds 2%. This means more stress on demand, especially from urban areas. Furthermore, automobile traffic has become increasingly dense, relying on 94% of petroleum products, with a predominance for diesel. Renewable energy resources have less impact on environment than traditional energy. They are generally more expensive than fossil energy. They are developed most often in the context of proactive policies that provide subsidies, redemption prices of electricity produced, and assistance of all sorts. The best choice for Algeria would be solar energy in the Sahara. Algeria has the largest solar potential in the Mediterranean area, with sunshine duration of almost all the territory of over 2,000 hours per year. Alternative options are wind energy, geothermal energy, hydropower, and biomass. Nuclear option generates low-cost electricity, but may lead to major risks, such as accidents, nuclear proliferation, and waste management. Algeria is ranked as the third world reserve of unconventional hydrocarbons, shale gas, and oil, after China and Argentina. Some shale gas wells have already been drilled in the Sahara for exploratory and confirmatory purposes. In order to study the link between economic growth and CO2 emissions in Algeria, we use annual time series data from the World Development Indicators database for the period 1973 and 2014. We process our empirical study with various econometric tests that are explained in the paper. Our conclusion is that there is no empirical link between CO2 emissions and economic growth, so Algeria may continue with its pro-growth policies without paying much attention to CO2 emissions. But the 2 degrees Celsius goal of the Paris Agreement should be translated into the energy policy and the low-carbon economic growth thanks to the development of new technologies like wind and solar energy, but also energy storage, carbon capture and storage. Investments in energy efficiency need the development of new financing instruments to transform the world's energy system. Energy transition is a possible route, which refers to a full use of 2 possibilities: energy savings and renewable energy development, with a new financial mechanism that will be implemented after 2020 to encourage developing countries to reduce the CO2 emissions. Algeria should consider energy transition as an opportunity to attract international funding and invest the money in the renewable energy technologies. Thank you.
Very much. Questions? Please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I couldn't, from the presentation, figure out specifically or quantitatively what is the potential of the renewable, in particular solar. I understand solar would be a great thing for Algeria, and I intuitively understand it. But the paper did not, at least the presentation, did not give any quantitative figures of what share solar at current prices or at future prices, projected prices, could be captured in an economically competitive way. That's one part. And the reason I ask this question is what I mentioned yesterday, is that we quite often hear about the great potential of solar in the Gulf, for example, being offered at 4 cents per kilowatt hour or under 4 cents per kilowatt hour. But I think one of the panelists yesterday from Lebanon made it very clear that this is the kilowatt hour that's delivered when the sun or when the wind is blowing at that price, not when the users demand it. So if you really want to do a full life cycle analysis, you have to integrate all of the additional costs, batteries, other backups, and what have you. So there was not much of quantitative to sort of support these conclusions. That's number one. Number two, it struck me that you said the hydro is potentially could contribute in Algeria. To my recollection, Algeria doesn't have much of a hydro. Even in the mountains, there are very limited flow of volume flow. Am I wrong?
We can see on this figure the different sort of energy in Algeria. And we don't want to speak about the price of solar energy because I think this is this will not be true because, as you said, we should consider the cost of this solar energy too. This is not really our objective in this paper. It is just to try to see how Algeria, with gas and oil exporting country, can use renewable energy as a new way to have this energy in a clean way. So, and contribute to Paris Agreement. Because in Paris Agreement, and it was settled before even in Copenhagen COP, they have created a climate fund. And this fund is to give money to developing countries from developed world to contribute to their energy transition. And this is very important for countries like Algeria. I have already studied this for Iran, and we have found that for Iran, it was important to make this energy transition, and it was clear that it would contribute to their economic growth. For Algeria, as you can see from our paper, it is not so clear. So maybe Algeria can continue to have the fossil fuel as objective, but we still want to give them some recommendations. This is only our recommendation, to use the solar energy from the Sahara, because they have potential in that.
Can you go back to the last slide, please, your conclusion?
No.
Right. Lack of awareness of the value and importance of renewable energy. I tend to disagree, although I'm Algerian, you may think that I'm biased, but I'm not involved in any policy making. And everything you have over there, I think the most important thing is the policy aspect. In terms of even answering Dr. Adnan's question, a lot of work has been done on renewable, whether they'll go on the PV. In fact, there has been a lot of plans, and they have developed, renewable energy, some plans. But there is no full commitment. And the numbers you mentioned, they're all available. They went in and out, They formulated, reformulated. Basically, there is all the information. The key question is a policy issue. It's a commitment, whether it's for clean energy or reforms. It's a much bigger agenda. So to me, the citizen, maybe there is a problem. They're not fully informed, but at least the young generation is fully aware. Very committed in terms of green energy. Maybe they don't have the details of everything. But again, what I would like to emphasize is maybe your third bullet point. That's the key one. The rest, we're just reinventing the wheel. They have done a lot of work. They're still doing it. So it's a question of implementation and will to implement. The rest, to me, it's not relevant.
I think it is important too, because when they will...
Explain when I say
Yeah.
maybe I didn't use the right word. What I mean, the homework has been done and redone. In fact, people are bored by the thing because they know what they have to do. They know what the problem is. They know the diagnostic. They know the solution. It's the policy issue. How we get the commitment to implement the thing.
Yeah. I think it is also important for the people to be informed of what is happening, because the government will cut the subsidies. They have already cut a lot of the subsidies, so they have to accept it. So if they are not aware about the final objective and that it will be for the future generations, maybe they will not accept it and they will be in the road like they are in France now. Energy transition raises geopolitical issues, because natural resources and energy give power to countries where they are located and to countries that have the technology to exploit them. So this is really a political issue.
With regard to hydro in Algeria, I'm thinking in Central Asia, Uzbekistan, and other places.
Microphone, please.
The mountains there are actually energy machines where, they trap the humidity goes up and you have rain and snow and you have a lot of multiple streams. The rural areas in Central Asia all have mini hydro, and it's an amazing contribution in terms of that area. Algeria might be able to use mini hydro systems like what the Soviet Union introduced there.
But the difference being is that one is year-round, and here it would be seasonal, limited to a few months. So you cannot have mini hydro running a year-round if you don't have rain year-round.
Well, actually, part of it in Uzbekistan, they had storage. They had multiple dams. And then
Flowing all year round in order to store it.
yeah, they created the storage to it's an interesting case to see. Another footnote, by the way, in the United States, surprisingly, wind power is contributing more than solar. Just a note.
Just, may I make one comment, please? I think the future is going to be very different than the present. So having a one technology that's going to be able to cover all months may not be the solution. It'll have to be a set of different distributed systems that are integrated in different complex and very interesting ways, actually. So we have to move away from a kind of modernist, centralized power system that solves all problems and creates many more, to a system that is an integrated, diversified portfolio, which requires a lot of flexibility, and capital is not used to making many different kinds of investments that are put together in sophisticated ways. And what is striking about the discussion today is really the way in which cost and benefit continues to be defined, right? So public health is not part of cost. Air pollution is not part of cost. Ground pollution is not part of cost. Water pollution is not part of cost. And we're still stuck, even though we know very well that the conventional economic valuation of cost and benefit is antiquated. And so it is really incumbent upon us to try to push the envelope in that direction, not only better estimation of real costs, and also thinking about the interesting, complex frontier of diversified portfolios that we can weave together in new ways. This is an enormous opportunity for engineers, for social planners, for technologists. It represents a huge opportunity for investment, but somehow we're still stuck in the European, Euro-American, modernist paradigm that does not enable us to think about local solutions that are appropriate to local places. It's a tragedy, really.
Would you like to respond? Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Osama Sayer from the Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research. He will talk to us about the virtual impact of electric vehicles on oil demand.
Today's topic, I know this topic. Well, the topic of impact of electric vehicles on oil demand been beaten to death, I must say. I think the literature doesn't need any more articles or any more papers. And the only reason I thought I'd just give it, it was just a curiosity, as a matter of fact. And the curiosity was a study done by ICA showing the variation of how, electric vehicles so far been, addressed in the literature. As you see, the annual sale, this is just, the percentage going around the variation, the fleet that we're expecting by 2040, the miles, and so on and so forth. And, I thought it's just, just to give it a shot again and really find out and what is it exactly, and, as a goal, as the ultimate goal of this paper or article, I would say, maybe not a paper, is just I want to really investigate the impact of the electric vehicles on oil demand and by two objectives. To examine the electric vehicles as an industry against the oil, basically, dynamics, I would call it. I don't know whether I'm using the right fancy economist terms, but something like this, which I'm going to show you later. That's number one. Number two, I would say there's implications, right? I mean, you're going to take the cars out of the road, and you're going to take the energy from the grid. So basically, you're going to take somewhere the energy there, where this energy really comes. I'm just trying to do some sort of back of envelope calculation. It's really macro level analysis. So the logic I went through when I did this, actually, I took two dimensions, if you say. What I call the correlation dimension, where I'm gonna examine and see the oil prices, how this is really developing with the electric vehicle sales. I know, again, as I said, it's a macro level, really not going into deep and depth, where maybe if someone is interested, maybe it's good for you to investigate more. That's number one. Number two, I want to see also the oil demand, how it's progressing or how it's affecting the electric vehicles. And I just found out there is an index. The inception, it's called the, what is that? The Crane Shares Electric Vehicles and Future Mobility, CARS. It's actually the inception date of this index. It's a New York Stock Exchange, January 2018. And I thought, wow, that would be really just to see how this is progressing when I see the oil demand. And basically, I thought, since I come from oil-rich country, Kuwait, I want to see, as an implication, where we go along this line. So let me just, start with this. Let me start with the left side, graph, where I'm just, showing here the right-hand side, the sales growth of the electric vehicles, versus the oil prices. And, maybe, again, someone would say this is superficial, you're not really tackling issues there. But that makes sense. Believe it or not, I was just reading an article, late 2014, beginning 14, where the oil prices took a dip. The Hummer sales in the United States went up. So it's a basic economic consumer behavior things, when oil prices goes down, because as for now, the electric component of electric vehicle right now, it costs around $190 per kilowatt hour. So for an electric vehicle of 100 kilowatt hour, this would be a 19,000. I'm talking about only the electric battery component. I'm not talking about the rest of the car. So $19,000 for electric. So it's still considerably high. Yeah, sure, there is an expectation by sometime to 2030, this 190 that goes down to 100. Well, that's still considerably high. So that's number one. Number two is of course, the internal combustion engine efficiency is doing much better. So, that's also a competition with the electric vehicle. Now, let me take you to the graph to the right-hand side, where I'm showing the average monthly stock price for cars. Okay, how this progress against the oil demand, this is some kind of a long term, annual. This is like day by day, or, I take it to quarterly within short terms. That's also confirms what I'm, again, that's a macro level, you call it superficial, but still the same, right? If you have more demand, it means, your oil price is doing well. So my stock went down. So this an indication probably needs by economists, needs to be looked more closely on, how the electric vehicles, is really behaving on this. Now, the other thing that, the other dimension of the analysis, what I call here the implications. Okay, I have electric vehicles that would take share of my fleet, passenger vehicle fleet. Okay, the implication now, the energy will come from the electric grid, and the electric grid need to be, have more energy, right? To meet the demand of this electric vehicle. And for the sake of the argument, I adopted the IEA EV30 at 30 scenarios. And as you see, by 2030, it's more than 200 million electric vehicles plug-in and of course with hybrid plug-in. But again, my assumption there, I would took it to the extreme where the plug-in has its 100% energy from the grid. So maybe I should just take you there. By 2030, now this is the case I'm analyzing, the oil demand, fleet demands, something like close to 27 million barrel equivalent per day. And again, with the scenario of EV30 scenario, the passenger vehicle is expected, the effect of it actually to withdraw 3.5 million barrel per day, that is from oil demand, and this 3.5 million to be taken from the electric energy. And I'm aware that, of course, this is not direct, meaning that if we're going to take 3.5 out of the oil demand, I'm going to take it from the electric grid exactly, but I'm assuming the same, because if you put the losses that I'm expecting from generation, transmission, so I would say I'm going to take 3.5 out of the oil, I'm going to take it from the electric energy, right? So, again, what I'm going to show you here, again, I know it's full, but let me start from this. The estimated electric power that I need to support my grid, okay, by 2030 would be an annual around 1,270 million barrel, which is equivalent to 2 terawatt of electricity. I need to support my grid, right? More energy to my grid to give this electric energy addition fleet. And again, we cannot assume that this extra electricity that can come from one technology, meaning, some I hear, I read through articles that we can provide this extra energy from renewables. No, we cannot do this due to many constraints. The geographic constraints, the infrastructure constraint, the economic constraint. So basically what I did and how I reached to variation of technology of generating electricity, taking the expected technologies of fuel that I need throughout the years to generate electricity. Believe it or not, I still have oil here somewhere and playing a part of my electric grid. And basically, electric, believe it or not, it is found from this analysis, the electric vehicle, even we understand that the oil will be phased out from the power sector. That's true. Not because of electric vehicles, due to other things. But having electric vehicle under the IEA EV30 will even push the oil and the oil fuel in the power sector even further. Okay, if you're expecting to phase out the oil from power sector by sometime 2040, we're going to see this even further. Okay, until of course you establish your infrastructure. So again, the implications of having EV more, as a matter of fact, it gives just more time for oil sector to be in the picture in the in the power sector. And I thought I'd just put this in general. This is the transportation sector in general, including passenger, commercial, aviation. As you see, the oil is really playing really a big part of it, okay? We're expecting more than 90%. Up to 2040, oil will be there. And I think EV, okay, it's going to be there, but EV has whatsoever no, implications on the oil demand. However, we see the internal combustion engine efficiency that's going to play really a role on the lowering the demand. However, note the compensation by number of vehicles. So we see some kind of balance. So that's why we see the oil, it's going to be there for some time. I thought I'd just give implications for how we're going to use as an oil in exporting countries. Is, you know, I've said this really a number of times in different occasions, that the oil exporting countries should really look at themselves or transform a policy from being a source of energy, okay, only to a policy that they have to adopt a policy and a transformation to a policy that they look at self, that they're supplier of value products from this oil. And this can be through, of course, improving their chemicals industry, investing in global markets that demands chemical and chemical feedstocks from their, of course, industry, integrating their domestic refineries with number of international chemical and petrochemical complexes. You know, this is really important. And investing in establishing an environmental friendly fuel, that we've been talking about this too much. I know Dr. Adnan is advocating this issue, and this is really important. And investing in environmental cleaning technologies. I know this is really what really affects if we're as an oil exporting countries as for our demand for the oil. And this is my last slide, is the bottom line. You know, electric vehicles, really there's no threat on oil demand. It's actually the way around. If there is a threat on the oil demand, is about the way the consumer side, actually, the policies that been witnessing through the environmental constraint, the technology, with, of course, other things. As a matter of fact, as we showed that through evidence, we show actually the oil is actually affecting the electric vehicle prosperity and, you know, development, not the way around. And of course, the rapid improvement of the ICE, internal combustion engine fuel engines are really, I think, will have the real impact on the oil demand. But this will be compensated by the number of vehicles that we witnessed on the earlier graph. The other things, the threat on oil demand actually arises really for those countries who adopt policy as looking at the oil as a source of energy. This is really obsolete type of now policy that should be left to a policy that they look for their oil as a value, as a byproducts, a number of products to the world. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Questions?
I have a question.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, so that was a very interesting presentation, but let me ask you why you assume that people want cars. I mean, the fact of the matter is you could replace the whole vehicle fleet here in Beirut with electric vehicles. It would still be a terrible drive. And so part of the transition, perhaps, is to get away from thinking of individual automobiles, which would change your analysis, I think, quite considerably. Secondly, the question I have is, what's your geographical location here? This is global? Is it specific to MENA countries? California will be very, very different in this regard. So I find this kind of analysis simply presentist and not thinking about what the possible alternatives for a better quality of life in terms of transportation might be, which would get us out of some of this trap. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this is really important, and I apologize, I have not mentioned this is a global, not for a specific region. It's mentioned clearly in the paper. And as we saw, the growth mainly is reflected with the new developing economies, India, China, where you're right, you know, maybe in Europe and California specifically, that the transportation and passenger transportation you might, find some kind of flattening or decay. But, other economy or other countries, I don't know. I'm just using. You're right. I'm not saying now, but it's a choice.
It's another political choice, so we
That's
should
right.
address it in those terms. It's
Again-
not an inevitability.
Again, it's all boiled down to a policy. You're right. If we now take a firm policy right now, the world global that we should have a zero carbon emission. You're right. We're going to see all this down, but unfortunately. You see the COP and the environmental or climate change treaties, how people in and out from these treaties, including the United States. See, I do understand, but I'm reflecting here on actually a forecast that expecting that the fleet, the passenger fleet, I'm not even talking about the commercial and aviation, this is only a passenger fleet, and how you see how rapidly is moving up. Yeah.
Thank you. We are significantly behind schedule in terms of time. So may I suggest that we move on to our next speaker, Dr. Naamat Al-Souf from the OPEC Fund, who will talk to us about addressing energy access in the context of energy transitions.
So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to be here representing OPEC Fund for International Development in this event. My presentation today is about energy access and how can we address this challenge within the context of energy transition. Sorry. In my presentation today, I will explore the status of energy access globally and in the Arab MENA region. Also, I will tackle on the investment needed to address this challenge, providing some innovative financial and technical solutions. Finally, I will talk about the pioneering role of OPEC Fund as in fighting energy poverty and providing energy access. Yeah. Globally, energy access to electricity improved over the last 15 years. Today, we have almost less than 1.1 billion people lacking access to energy. Yes, there's a big improvement, around 1.2 get access, but we still have big people still using kerosene and other type of energy for lighting. And if we consider all the efforts that is taking now and the investment planned over the next 15 years, we will see that we will still have around 600 to 700 people lacking energy, mainly in Africa, electricity. And if we look to the people who's using non-traditional fuel for cooking, the picture even is worse. Today we have around 3 billion people using wood and other biomass for cooking, emitting a lot of CO2, and we, every year we have around 4 million people died due to smokes, in-house smokes, and other diseases, most of them women and children. But even with the current effort that the world is undertaking, we will continue having by 2030 around 2.7 people still lacking access to clean cooking fuel. This is not shown here, sorry. If we look to the Arab region, also there is a big improvement in the North Africa, Mashriq and GCC countries. But still, despite that, we will still have some areas having lack of electricity access, mainly in Sudan, Mauritania, and Yemen. But the Arab country also faces other problem within the electricity access, which is we have in so many areas unplanned service disruptions and power outages, which add to the problem of electricity. Of course, in addition, as you all know, the region also suffering from war and instability, and this will add to the challenge of energy access. Before moving to investment needed to address this energy access, I just would like to make one point regarding, or in the context of the debate of addressing energy transition within the context of climate change. As of today, in most of the conferences, we are talking mainly about Europe, some other developed country, that if we take the population is more than around 1 billion people. If all this 1 billion people, have renewable energy or using clean energy, we still have a problem with the climate because of the 3 billion people still emitting heavily to the environment. Therefore, in our discussion about the climate change and how to mitigate and this, we should not forget the people and their needs to meet their energy demand. The investment needed to address the three pillars or the three targets of the energy for all targets is around, some estimates put it at around 1.3 trillion. But what's important to see is what's needed for access is only around a very small amount or very small percentage, around 50 billion per year, to reach the universal access by 2030, according to the 2030 agenda. But we will, as we can see in this next slide, sorry. Oh, sorry. Seems, anyway, if we would like to reach, how to say, 100% access. Okay, fine. Okay, fine, thank you. If we would like to reach 100% access for the electricity by 2030, we need a cumulative investment around 790 billion, which is around 56, 57 billion yearly. But this is based on all case, how to say, or all energy for all. But what's the reality is what we are going to invest is much less than that. The investment gap is around, yearly investment gap around $20 billion. And this is also considered a little bit optimistic estimation because the current level of investment in energy access, in electricity access, or energy access in general is less than 20 billion. That means if we extrapolate the current commitment, even we will not reach to this level. To close this gap, of course, we need all available type of funds from ODA, public-private partnerships, and foreign investment, and even local investment. But even then, there will be a need for more innovative financial vehicles, more credible policy options, and more cost-effective technology. Let me start by financing solutions. For countries with energy access deficit, there are several innovative financial options. One option is the convertible grant scheme used to mitigate the high risk of small-scale energy access projects. The grant will cover the first losses, otherwise it will be returned, of course, without any interest rate. We in OFED worked with REAP, Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Partnership, on one project on revolving capital pool. This project offers a repayable grant at zero interest rate to start a business to help them provide affordable modern energy services and unlock their expansion potential. Also, we have other option, which is aggregated solution. That means we put together a number of smaller projects just to make them from the commercial banks to be eligible to get finance. In OFED, we worked in Armenia and we provided $10 million loan for a local bank, and the bank provide small funds to SMEs involved in the construction and operation of small hydropower plant. However, what will underpin financing energy access in developing countries is the creation of investment enabling environment. This environment, I think we talked a lot about policy and should be politically, institutionally, and economically stable at the micro level and have regulatory framework at the micro level. Therefore, governments need to maintain long-term policy commitments, diverse energy access strategy, devise energy access strategies, and implementation plans that are linked to the national and development plans. Also have regulatory framework, as I mentioned, and establish institutional capacity to prepare and implement qualified pipeline and deals with bankable projects. This brings me to the third issue is the technology solution. Of course, technology solution for energy access must match the problem. The majority of people who is lacking energy access are in rural area. Electricity access in this area, of course, cannot economically and realistically be achieved by only extending the grid. Therefore, we need some innovative decentralized solutions like mini grids, distributed solutions, PV panels, and other options. Actually, according to the IEA, they are expecting 40% of a new capacity needed to ensure universal energy access will come from decentralized solutions. However, these decentralized solutions still facing many challenges, including financial and operational challenge, and also they have some other issue regarding the availability of skills or capacity to operate and maintain this systems for a long period. From our side in OFED, we are working with the Alliance for Rural Electrification to support and accelerate the deployment and productive use of hybrid mini-grids in a number of countries, including Bangladesh, India, Mali, Mozambique, and many others. Each mini grids with this hybrid will utilize PV technology together with either diesel or biomass. Sorry. Now, just let me, before closing, share with you some of its experience and activities in fighting energy poverty. In OFID, we recognize early that access to modern energy services is a vital precondition to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal. Our campaign for eradication of energy poverty started early in 2007. And 2008, it marks our 8th anniversary of our initiative, Energy for the Poor. This effort started in Riyadh, by Riyadh Declaration issued by the conclusion of the 3rd OPEC Summit in November 2007, which established the issue of eradication of energy poverty as an objective for OFID and other financial institution for our member countries. In 2012, our Ministerial Council approved $1 billion revolving fund for this issue. In OFID, to address this issue, we have a strategy based on 3 pillars: advocacy, operational grounds, and partnerships. On the first pillar, we have advocated tirelessly for energy to be given the priority it deserves in the post-2030 agenda. And we worked with other partners to put energy in this agenda. And now we see that energy access for reliable, affordable, and modern energy is at the core of the 2030 agenda as SDG 7 in the set of 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Yes, but energy poverty is a challenge that cannot only be overcome through through strategic partnerships, which is the other pillar of our strategy. For example, we have collaborated with the World Petroleum Council, and we established what is known with the Oil and Gas Industry Energy Access Platform to leverage the industry capability to pursue the SDG 7. Also, we are part of the deep dive process of the World Bank with the other Arab coordinating group to also cooperate on the targets of achieving SDG 7. Also, we are part of the Arab coordinating group, OECD DAC task force on energy to work on energy projects in sub-Saharan Africa. The third pillar of our strategy is actions on the ground. In 2017 alone, we invested around $500 million in energy projects. This took our cumulative investment to around $55 billion since inception. 78% of this amount has been committed since 2008, after we have this initiative on energy for the poor. Of course, all our windows, public, private, trade, and grants contributed to this amount. The Arab world has been allocated around 45% from our commitment since 2008, or around 1.6 billion, and to finance energy projects in many countries, including Egypt, Sudan, Jordan, and Yemen, Tunisia, Morocco, Palestine, and many others. I finished the last slide now. In our operation for energy projects, we recognize the era of energy transition. Our operation is technology neutral, and many of them concern renewable and distributed energy generation. By that, I will finish my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. May I suggest we go to the coffee break and then have the discussion over there because we're already eating into it. 10 minutes, we're 10 minutes late.